Today, we're going to be talking about circuit riders. And so you can see a picture of a man with a horse, a man on a horse. We have a little electronic newsletter that goes out on the weekend we call the Short Circuit. I want you to know that these circuit riders had a very long circuit. Many of them had circuits that were 300 to 400 miles long, and many stops along the way. They were out in all kinds of weather. They tried to stop every 4 to 6 weeks at every place. Because of the arduous nature of their work, most of them were single men. They were out in all kinds of weather and had meager accommodations. Half of them died before they were 33 years old. They were very committed to the mission of the church. They were so dedicated that there was an old saying. When it was a bad weather day, people would say, "There's nothing out today but crows and Methodist preachers." In the early years of our congregation, we were not yet a station church. That's where you have a pastor assigned to you who's there full time. And so for the first years of our church, we had circuit riders. And I want to share with you a little bit of a picture of what life was like around here 200 years ago in 1811. First of all, 1811 is the year in which Worcester became the county seat of Wayne County. But Wayne County was larger geographically then than it is now. In the first half of the 19th century, political subdivisions kept getting smaller as the population grew. Wayne County in 1811 encompassed what we would think of as Wayne, Holmes, and Ashland County. And in the earliest census that I can find, in 1815, in that whole area, there were 759 men living. Now, the women and children weren't counted because they were politically insignificant at that time. But you can gather from the number of men who were counted. I'm not saying the women shouldn't have been counted. They just, the count was for political purposes. But you can gather just how sparsely settled this whole area was. And Worcester Township, where our city is currently located, had only 241 men over the age of 21 living in it. Now, by contrast, the great city of Cincinnati in 1811 had 2,300 residents. 2,300 residents. It was a rough time. As late as 1812, the Oak Chapel Methodist group was meeting in a log fort to protect themselves from Native Americans during their worship. Chief Kilbuck did not die until 1811. And things were different back then. Often, I've had people at this service who like traditional music for their worship to complain about that contemporary music because it doesn't have any notes with it, so you don't know what you're singing. Well, I want to show a hymnal from 1836. This is the 1836 hymnal. And I want you to know there are no notes in this hymnal. There are 800 hymns in this tiny little book, and I have trifocals, and when I open it, I have to pull this out to be able to read it. The hymn singing was done a cappella, and the way it was done was that people knew a basic repertoire of tunes, and the preacher or leader would begin by singing, and people would catch the tune and follow through if they were able to read. If they weren't, the preacher would sing a line, and then the congregation would sing a line. Things were different in worship back then. Worship styles do change. And in the West, men prayed on their knees. No sitting in pews. That was a soft Eastern custom. When people prayed during worship, they were praying on their knees. Lots of differences back then. I want to talk about maybe the archetypical circuit rider. Our next picture is a picture of a circuit rider riding through the rain, and the next picture is a picture of Peter Cartwright. This is a man I'd like to talk about for a while. He was different in several respects from the typical circuit rider because he lived a full life. He lived to be 87 years old. He was also untypical in that he was married. He had a number of children and had a farm, I suspect, which supported his family in his absence. He was born in Virginia, and in the year 1801, he was converted to the faith in Kentucky. Then he followed a path of 6 months of participation in class meetings. That was mandatory if you wanted to be a member of the Methodist Episcopal Church. And at the end of that 6 months, he got his ticket and was connected. That's what it meant to be a member. You got your ticket and you were connected. At age 17, he became an exhorter. This is someone who stands up and shares their spiritual experience to encourage other people. And by 1802, he was a circuit preacher, and he preached in Kentucky, he preached in Tennessee, he preached in Ohio, he preached in Indiana, he preached in Illinois, finally winding up in Illinois, where he was a presiding elder for over 50 years. A presiding elder is the equivalent of district superintendent today. He was a presiding elder for 50 years. He was noteworthy in a couple of other ways. This guy was everywhere. He was the chaplain for Andrew Jackson's army at the Battle of New Orleans. In 1832, he ran against Abraham Lincoln for the state assembly in Illinois and beat him. And then in 1846, he ran against Abraham Lincoln for Congress, and Lincoln defeated him. And there's a wonderful anecdote from that campaign. Lincoln came to Peter Cartwright's hometown, and he was having a revival, and Lincoln slipped into the congregation, and Cartwright noticed him, so he thought he'd have a little fun with him. And so the congregation, how many of you want to go to heaven? And a lot of people raised their hand. And then he said, and how many of you don't want to go to hell? And everybody else raised their hand except Lincoln. And so Cartwright said, well, Mr. Lincoln, where do you want to go? Lincoln rose slowly to his feet and said, I want to go to Congress. Cartwright was also a member of every general conference through the 1860s, including the 1844 General Conference, where the denomination split over the issue of slavery. In those early days, they did not have grand buildings like ours to gather people in, and so when they had a religious gathering, they would call a camp meeting. This was an outdoor meeting where there would be preacher after preacher and song after song around the campfire, and it was a community social event, one that drew not just the religious people, but the rowdies as well. Often the rowdies would show up with a keg of whiskey on the back of a wagon, and they'd get very drunk, and they would try to be disruptive. In the fall of 1806, Peter Cartwright was one of the preachers at the Ohio District Quarterly Conference. And they had a camp meeting, and typically the rowdies got worse as the weekend went along. These meetings went from Thursday to Sunday, and the drunk and disorderly got more drunk and more disorderly as the weekend went on. Peter Cartwright was assigned to be the 8 a.m. Sunday morning preacher. And as he got up to preach, there were a gang of rowdies, still drunk from Saturday night, and armed with dirks and clubs and knives and horsewhips, and they intended to riot, which they did. They tried to prevent him from continuing the service, and the ringleader, and I'm quoting from his autobiography now, he made 3 passes at me, intending to knock me down. The last time he struck at me, by the force of his own effort, he threw the side of his face toward me. It seemed at that moment I had not power to resist temptation, and I struck a sudden blow in the burr of the ear, and I dropped into the earth. So religion was not for the faint of heart back in those days. And there was a lot of religious competition, too, especially between the Methodists and the Presbyterians. In 1811, Peter Cartwright was invited to speak at an ecumenical gathering in the great city of Cincinnati, Ohio. Remember, it had 2,300, and the Presbyterians and Methodists were involved in this joint effort. But Peter Cartwright had anti-Presbyterian pamphlets printed and distributed them before the meeting, preached, and then hightailed it back to Kentucky. In 1812, there were enough Methodists in the West that the Western Conference was divided into two conferences, the Tennessee and the Ohio conferences. Peter Cartwright becomes kind of the archetype of all of the circuit riders. Now I would like to show you the next person I want.